No puedo creer esto. No, 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 no.
One of the days of the calendar will mark your death, will mark my death. And death is something that we are afraid of in our culture. Not in the old way of being afraid of the unknown, being afraid of the uncertainty, or later, the dogmatic hell, the infernos that were conjured up out of the imaginations of men, arguably the imaginations of gods. Death now is a wholly material affair. It is the ceasing of life. It is the body giving up, the life force, the consciousness presumably disappearing. The idea that there is some soul is, like heaven above us, not encountered so readily. It used to be that people would think that God was in heaven in a cloud until we learned to fly. They used to think that the seat of the soul was the pineal gland in the mind, and we'll still see pinecone symbolism all around the world. We looked and no soul is apparent. And therefore, perhaps our consciousness is just that, a peculiarity of evolution, of our struggle to survive. One day, this self that we think is somehow separate than the rest of the universe will cease to exist, will fade back into nothingness. The independence of thought that we think we enjoy will disappear. Religion has always been the way to deal with this fact, to ameliorate the pain which it presents. The idea that we will cease to exist and the memories people have of us will likewise cease to exist can potentially be a troubling one, and people tend to get more religious the closer they get to death. And that could be through aging. People tend to get more religious as they age, but it could also be in a foxhole. There are no atheists in foxholes was the idea from the trenches of the First World War. We fear death, we fear non-existence. But if we can accept that, then we rely on spirituality not as a crutch, not as some sort of panacea for our emotional and spiritual pain caused by the knowledge of our own future and inevitable non-existence. We have more access to information now than has ever been the case in history. We have a degree of freedom of speech because the powers that be both realize that it's very difficult to constrain access to information, and more importantly, realize man's infinite capacity for distraction. It results in people not looking at the information that may be more interesting or more useful for them. They are more compelled to look at nonsense, which is fine. Of course, it's quite a normal human tendency. We all fall down the rabbit hole of distraction. But we do have access to information that would previously have been locked behind many decades of study in a monastery, in a far removed legal library, within secret societies, within all sorts of different ways of restricting access to information. Well, these have largely come down with the lower barriers to entry of the internet for sharing texts. No longer do monks have to meticulously copy out the old texts of yore. No longer do they have to be transcribed by people, by scribes, onto limited materials. Now we can obviously scan them and then send them in a digital format free around the world. This means that we, as the general population, the vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. The fact is that we, as the general population, have more access now to information that's ever been before. And this gives us a peculiar conundrum in that while we have so much information, we are drowning in it. We need some sort of curation of it. And this not being available to us, we are lost. We are drowning in a sea of this information, trying to learn, trying to pick out some sort of salient details, trying to construct our own narrative, our own sense of order, some order ab chaos, some order out of the chaos of the amount of information that we then find available to us. And the fascinating thing about this is that there is some possibility of finding something that is unfamiliar, that is not part of our culturally received narrative, not part of the ideas that we are taught in our state-sponsored schools, not part of the traditions that are handed down to us by our parents and those around us. And there is an old saying, there's no smoke without a fire, and therefore the mystical experience that you may see ranging across cultures, whether that be in religion, in the esoteric sects, in all of the different forms in which it reaches us, whether anecdotally or within our own mystical experience, whether that be some tiny glimpse of something beyond the everyday. This is something that perhaps is worth pursuing, and the motivation to do so is not necessarily a financial one. It's not necessarily one of triumph over others, the will to power. It is from a curiosity that it is born, and it is from a curiosity that it is pursued. It's also from a desire to understand, a philosophy, a love of knowledge itself. The texts, the traditions, the religions that have been founded upon these mystical experiences, whether that be by Jesus, by Muhammad, by the Sufi mystics, by the Buddhist mystics, by all of the different individuals whose ideas, whose insights, whose illuminations have had whole religions founded upon them, have had whole dogmas built upon and concreted around the very living experience that they enjoyed, but also were transformed by. This is something that is intrinsically no longer just an intellectual exercise, no longer something that is just locked away for the precious few. The fact is that the information that you have available to you at the touch of your fingers on your iPad, on your computer, on your phone, has the finger pointing towards the moon, has those sort of indications, those traces that may lead you in the direction of the infinite. And with the skeptical, rational mode of inquiry that the scientific method has given to us, by the ability to discern right from wrong, or at least attempt to do so, we can sniff out a hoax, we can find the charlatans, we can find the dreamy and optimistic ideas for, oh, maybe I'm special, maybe I'm somehow different. We can throw those out, and we can hopefully find some kernel of truth amongst the dross, amongst the self-serving, mind-numbing idiocy that may be some sort of collapse into drugs or any other sort of financial, I will make myself some sort of spiritual leader and profit from it. We can find something that is therefore a personal experience, something that we ourselves can benefit from, and perhaps by doing benefit others as well. The ability to do so is both in the mind. Of course, we love to learn, we love to seek out those facts, but it is also in those signposts that allow us to understand the exercises, whether that be the more esoteric yogas or the meditation practices that we can then put into our own lives and hopefully transform not just our minds but our bodies, and therefore our spirits as well. The access is now so amazing so possibly transient as well, that it behoves us to seize it, carpe diem, to fulfill the duty of spiritual progress in a culture and a society that no longer treasures it in the same way that it did, in a culture and society that is lost in some ways, and that perhaps we can enjoy, create, learn, understand, and seek that illumination that if we look to the few individuals of the past whom our ancestors have held up, those are the people, those are the individuals who point to something beyond the flesh, point to something possible, perhaps. Whether that's possible at all, we're not sure. But the fact is we're able to understand in a way that has never been the case, has never been in the same possible structure as we now have. We find that words fail us, and yet the words themselves are available. They're signposts, and it might be somehow interesting to follow them. And the idea of spirituality as being a deeply personal thing exists in the major religions as well. In Judaism, it's kavanah. In Christianity, they talk about being recollected. They talk about the prayer of quiet, as opposed to the more traditional and more normal today, discursive prayer. Prayer is a discussion. Prayer of quiet was to seek that deeper connection with God. Not just to think about God, to talk to God, to feel about God, but to essentially merge and become part of God, to feel God itself. The prayer of quiet. In Sufi mysticism in Islam, they talked about fanafil sheikh, which is the merging with the teacher, or eventually fanafillah, which is merging with Allah. This I discovered by a chap called Shinzen Young, a really interesting modern mystic. The idea with this is that mysticism and spirituality have this deeply personal element that is not possible to share with everybody. People have different concerns, different needs, different desires, different capabilities even. And the religions use dogma, use that sort of cultural understanding, that cultural planning to take the kernel of spirituality, the true core of it, and use it to build an edifice upon, but an edifice built by man as opposed to inspired by God. Rumi, the mystic poet from Sufism, says that if the rose is destroyed, the rose is degraded, where can you then find the rose? And the answer is in the rose water. So among those spiritual texts in Christianity, among those Gnostic texts, among the non-canonical Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Judas, these are the tiny parts, the indications of the truth that we can then use to find our own way. There are many routes to the kingdom. There are many roads to the top of the mountain. And so by using these as signposts and not as crutches, we can then seek to deepen our own spiritual growth, our own spiritual understanding. One of the main reasons why monasteries even existed was to pursue that spiritual experience. What equivalent do we have today? The idea that you may take, for example, a 10-day Vipassana retreat with meditating every day and not speaking is something that is possible, but generally not done. The yoga classes that we do are so watered down to be just physical exercise compared to the yoga of the traditions. And so spiritual life is something that has to happen upon us. And this is historically very rare. There may have been ceremonies among shamans who used hallucinogens, mushrooms and other ideas like this that would actually open up the mind and allow people to experience something outside of their day-to-day reality. In a lot of meditative thought, the idea is that these are shortcuts, mere glimpses of something that is possible. I haven't done drugs or smoked, so I don't know, but I would assume that it would be a glimpse of something that is possible with meditation or practice or some other idea of this. For example, during dreaming or during near-death experiences, there is actually the same chemicals released in the brain as under some certain hallucinogenic drugs. With this, what we're looking to really understand is how can we trigger those spiritual experiences, those higher levels, as Celia Green would talk about, that are written about in the past, that seem to exist, and yet are very rare today. We may hope through our lifestyle that they will suddenly burst upon us like rays of sunlight, but more in control would be to read around the subject. That's going to give us the dry knowledge. It's going to give us the timber and the kindling and the little sticks that we can use to create the fire of spiritual growth. By gathering amounts of information, accounts from people who've already walked this path, we can believe it's possible. We can understand how they did it, and therefore we can follow that same path in our own way ourselves. And just like the old churches are preserved, built up from the ancient stone, and no longer the centre of village life, but more a destination for tourists to visit, so the old religions are propped up and preserved, and you have people who are running around trying to keep the traditions that were started so long ago that people have forgotten why they really existed. There's a lovely story about monkeys in a room, and you put some monkeys in a room, you have a stepladder in there, and you have bananas at the top of it. Monkeys see the bananas, run up the ladder, and the other monkeys that have remained on the ground are electrified, shocked. And so they pull the monkey down and they give him a good thrashing, and so on, until none of the monkeys will dare to go up to get the bananas because the other monkeys will beat them up. You then introduce another monkey. He immediately sees the bananas and tries to shoot up the ladder to get them, and the other monkeys pull him down and beat him. He hasn't been electrified, so he doesn't know what's going on. And bit by bit, you introduce more and more monkeys, new ones. They get beaten up when they try to go up the ladder, and you remove the monkeys one by one that were there originally, that had actually been shocked. Eventually, what you end up with is a room full of monkeys who will not go up that ladder to get the bananas, and they don't know why. It's quite a nice metaphor. Likewise with an elephant. If you tie a tiny baby elephant with a very, very strong chain, he will tug and try to get free and be unable. And then later on, when he is much, much bigger and wouldn't be able to be held by that chain, you can actually hold him, and as is actually the case in India, for example, with a very small cord. He could easily snap it, of course, and yet he won't, because he assumes, having tried when he was smaller and less able, that it would be impossible. There are a number of different things like this that have a lot of parallels. And is it any coincidence that the great mystics, the hermits, have become those world-denying troglodytes for a time? Those people who went out alone into the desert, into the desolate wild places, in search of something different than they encountered in their culture. For example, Jesus went into the desert. Muhammad, again, went into the desert. A lot of the Buddhist mystics go into retreats, and the Hindu mystics as well go away from civilization. The ability to do this retreat, this hermitage is now greater than ever, because you can have an internet business that makes enough money to buy the material essentials that you need for physical survival, the food, the shelter, and so on. And so by starting a small internet business, not necessarily to get rich, nor to build some sort of part in civilization for you, but to create the opportunity to sustain yourself, to provide enough value ongoing that you can actually, apart from society, survive. This loneliness, this unique perspective provided by a complete immersion in your own thoughts and feelings, away from the turbulence of the civilization, can be spiritually productive and has been seen to be in previous mystics. Why is this the case? Is it that God or something higher is found in the desert, in those wild places? I don't think so. I think that there is a signal to noise ratio, and in this video some of the signal, the audio which we're recording, has been affected by noise. You have signal and you have noise. The noise is the noises that we don't want, the interference from the radio frequencies that we found around us that interfere with the wireless microphones that we use. You have signal and you have noise. Now, if you are living in civilization, if you are part of the culture, you have this great deal of noise, and therefore any spiritual signal is completely deadened and drowned out, deafened by the sheer amount of noise that you find around us. Emotional noise, mental noise, even physical noise in terms of the demands on your body are different. If you are able to set up some sort of survival apart from society, you are able to have the be loud grove, as William Butler Yeats talked about, then you can reduce the amount of noise and tune in and recognize and understand the signal that it is already around you, it's already there. But apart and with the silence of the wild places, you can hear it and learn from it. And therefore, a major part of spirituality is actually creating the setup necessary to reduce the amount of noise that you find around you, so that you can pay attention to the signal that's already there. And another aspect to the signal to noise ratio is the noise that you introduce within yourself. By silencing yourself, you become, in Buddhist terminology, like a mirror that can reflect the divine. They have an enormous amount of different ideas about doing this, whether that's being much more peaceful in terms of not being aggressive, not getting overly excited, and so on, to more physical ideas such as not eating meat and having a vegetarian or vegan diet. All of these have been suggested by many, many years of people following the mystical path. And therefore, how much can we take in as being valid and worthwhile anecdotally, and how many do we have to feel are just locked in tradition? The idea of chanting a certain name, for example, or following a certain ritual reminds me of Skinner's pigeons from his psychology experiment, in which the pigeons were fed at random intervals. First they were fed when they, for example, nodded their heads, and after a while they learned to nod their heads quite on cue. When they wanted to be fed, they would nod their heads and they would be fed. and later they were fed on a random schedule. And you would think that they would not know what to do, but each pigeon actually managed to create all number of different means that he thought were actually bringing the food to him. So maybe it's nodding ahead, or maybe it was spinning around in circles, maybe it was plucking a feather out, all sorts of things that only one instance of actually coinciding with being fed was enough to make them ignore the many other instances when, just by sheer chance, they weren't being fed. So I think a lot of superstition, a lot of practices have become like this, have been passed down, have become like those monkeys with a ladder. People don't really know why they're doing them. They don't know that they actually are effective. And if they are effective once for one person, maybe they're not effective for another person. People will follow them and just reason that that's the way it was always done. I think to really reduce the amount of noise within yourself, you need to do a very personal self-analysis. You need to know yourself. Know yourself was one of the advice axioms, aphorisms written at the oracle in Delphi in ancient Greece. And so when you seek to know yourself, you also have the second aphorism there, nothing in excess. Nothing in excess is always going to be a good standard to live through. You can also see in Taoism, knowing when enough is always enough by Lao Tzu. The idea is that when you are seeking to reduce the amount of noise within yourself, by reducing your exposure to extreme, you keep yourself on a level keel. You keep yourself sailing without dashing around the place and being distracted and breaking your concentration. The philosopher Schopenhauer calls it like a fractured diamond in his polemic against noise in the street. It's quite a funny essay actually. And so when you are seeking this path, you need to go inside yourself introspectively and understand which things cause you to be off balance. If you eat certain foods, how do you feel after that? If you associate with certain people, how do you feel? If you read certain texts, if you watch certain programs, be very aware of the exposures to the world around you, and indeed the things that you can choose to think about, and how that affects your peace of mind. To reduce the noise, you reduce the noise outside, but also pay attention to reducing the noise inside as well. That way you can focus on the signal. That's the most important part. There's an old saying that there's no smoke without a fire, and therefore looking at the mystical experience across a whole range of different cultures and belief systems, I am compelled to believe that there is some sort of experience that is beyond the biology of the everyday, beyond the physics of the possible within our materialistic world. This could very easily be wishful thinking on my part, a natural fighting against the limitations of the physical body in which I find myself, a natural way of thinking of myself as somehow special or the human race as somehow different. The idea that spirituality is a young man's game, is something that is natural and innate in a child, is, I would suggest, wrong. Because if, for example, you explain to a child that the points of light in the sky are stars, and then try and explain how the stars were formed, as far as we know, and the sheer extent of the universe, they may listen, they may think about it, but they can never really understand the sheer scale of the universe in the same way that we can't. Likewise, if you talk to them about love, or hate, or war, these are things that you can't understand unless you experience them. And it's the same with spirituality. Through direct and personal experience, and that is how you experience it. Otherwise, it's just concepts and passed on pieces of knowledge that can only mildly mimic the pure understanding. In Zen, for example, A lot of the koans, the stories, are completely incomprehensible from a rational perspective. And so the monks were made to spend an enormous amount of time contemplating them. And the idea is that once enlightened, the monks would just understand them. Trying to understand them, their mind would give up. Their mind would snap, and that would allow the satori, the enlightenment, to come through. When you consider spirituality, Jesus began preaching at around 30 years old, died at 33. Muhammad got his message from God a lot later. And so spirituality is not a young man's game really, nor is it of any age. But it does require a degree of experience of the world, and more importantly, a personal experience. And the Bible is, of course, a collection of books. The very word tells us that. And the interesting thing about this is that the methods of the ancient Greeks, for example, of reason and argument, were developed and advanced by those early Christians who were deciding which of those texts would make it into the final canon and which ought to be excluded. This development of scholastic method and research actually meant that the scientific method was developed out of this. And this meant to strengthen and bolster religion actually led in many ways to its demise. But it led to the demise of religion written by man. There are a number of objective claims by religion that were later found to be completely against that of science. For example, the geocentric universe compared to the heliocentric universe. And for example, the pendulum, Foucault's pendulum, was actually one of my favorite experiments when the pendulum was swinging back and forth, and as it drew that hourglass shape as the world turned beneath it, proved that science had the objective hold on reasoning and threw the whole world into disarray. Now, the interesting thing about this is that those methods that killed religion didn't kill spirituality, because that's very much founded upon faith. Obviously, we can say you have to have faith in those books, those texts that the prophets transcribed, and in the case of the Quran, for example, have the literal word of God. The idea with this is that when we are reading, when we are looking through those texts with the pure, piercing eye of scientific reasoning, we may believe that we are somehow more enlightened, and indeed, compared to those earlier methods, we are, as Newton said, standing upon the shoulders of giants. Science and religion have always been unhappy, uncomfortable bedfellows. But scientists haven't always been atheists, of course. In fact, some of the greatest scientists, for example, Sir Isaac Newton, he actually was deeply religious. And there's the story about him inviting one of his colleagues to his house and having some enormous model of the universe that was incredibly intricate. When he asked Isaac, where was this made? And Isaac will actually come out and say, well, no, it didn't get made, it was just there, I just found it. The friend says, well, I can't believe it. You know, Isaac, that's crazy. Like, how would that possibly be? And he was therefore pointing out the design argument for the universe. There are a number of different arguments for God, the cosmological, the teleological, the design argument, but we're not going to really cover those. The important thing is, if we try and approach God, spirituality, from this sort of very rational sense, we will always come up short. If you look at Einstein, a very clever scientist again, his idea of God was not this sort of master looking down upon his children with all the answers. It was some sort of mystical experience of God that wasn't really knowable. Feynman, for example, the later physicist, talked about the idea of the idea of God being too provincial, too close to home. You know, that God came to the earth, and that's probably true. But the idea of something higher, something unknowable, doesn't really get demolished by this. We have that degree of faith. And it may be that our mind's genesis actually inclines us to that. The idea of cause and effect. If something is here, then obviously something has to have caused. There has to be that initial cause. One of the most enlightening parts of studying philosophy for me, for example, was the idea that language itself creates the questions, creates those conundrums, creates those unknowable answers, creates the paradoxes that confuse us. It's language itself, it's our interpretations of the world that actually create questions where none exist. In the same way that, for example, in a lot of Asian religions, the idea of community becomes only because we can actually see the world like a fractured diamond through the light glaring through it. It's our interpretations that actually create the questions that needn't exist. Our perspective makes us confused. By relaxing into faith, we may feel that we are being lulled into sleep, but we may also be being sacrificed into the unknowable and following a faith that is intrinsically our own. And Carl Jung quotes a rabbi as saying that the reason why God does not speak to us in the same way as he apparently used to is that now no man will stoop low enough. And the idea isn't that we should be bowing and scraping on the floor like some sort of disgraceful servant worthy of the master's glance. It's that now we have set ourselves up as God, as that sense of judgment, able to rationally decide whatever comes into our own mind, to be able to know everything, as Hegel would talk about. I prefer the view of Søren Kierkegaard, who had the idea that there are three spheres of existence, and then finally the sphere of faith, founded upon by Abraham, the first Muslim, submitting completely to God's will and God's plan, not following the dogmatic beliefs of right or wrong, but subsuming himself within the core idea of a greater power of which he is unable to know, that is beyond human understanding. This concept doesn't fit well with our rational age. The idea that there are some things that aren't knowable is being pushed, is being encountered by some of the scientists, physicists mainly, who are working at the very field of human ability, the very field, for example, of far astronomy, where the sheer numbers completely boggle the mind, and also with ideas of artificial intelligence, superintelligence, that it would be to us as we are to the ants. So now we are on our journey in science starting to come back to the idea that there are things that we aren't able to know, that we will never be able to understand. We're too limited by our biology, by the very consciousness that allows us to perceive the world, to understand the world. Well, our belief that God has to be rationally argued, completely understood, has obviously killed God, because you have to prove something. The burden of proof is always on the person who exerts an effort to show you something, to say, I believe in this, I believe in that. Bertrand Russell's teapot, for example. Well, now, what we're doing is we're coming to the idea that there are limits to human knowledge, and the faith itself is the important part. There are things that we aren't able to know, and by having faith in them, we are sacrificing our rationality, sacrificing our reason. And why not? Because people who are religious are happier. They are more content. Those questions of life are answered for them. And that can be on a very basic, banal level, from where the world comes to, and they'll find a book with an answer in. It's been disproved in a lot of cases by science, and we end up with the God of the gaps. But if we perhaps heretically, forget all of the books and find that personal relationship with God and then trust in that alone. It's no longer a God of the gaps because it is everything. It is beyond understanding. And maybe we have never lived in a better time to deepen our own spiritual growth because we have such an enormous access to information. And this may have come about for secular reasons. More freedom for the people means that they can create more value. Huey P. Long, every man is a king. But that freedom of speech, that freedom of information allows us to encounter those texts that otherwise would have been hidden under lock and key, that would have been guarded very preciously by whole orders of secret societies. Well, now you can download them and read them on the metro. The idea that with the printing press we had a greater access to information is true, but the fact that we can all read now, that we can all read English and, for example, other languages through Google Translate, well, that's entirely unprecedented. We have such an access to information that we can therefore accelerate our own growth, our own spirituality. In his essays, Francis Bacon says that a little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth man's mind back to religion. And so our age is a secular age. Religion, spirituality isn't necessarily a good thing for the people because they're not going to consume as much. But the very same benefits that are afforded us by the capitalist society in which we live can be used in different ways, can be used in ways that weren't intended, and can be used by us to further our own growth. From the scientific method itself, we may think that, like Nietzsche did, God is dead. We killed him. And the idea that by sheer rationality, by proper textual analysis, we may find faults in the major religions. Well, that's definitely true. But we can also use the same method to protect ourselves from charlatans, protect ourselves from flowery ideas and circular logic, and therefore come back to those kernels of truth, like Descartes did, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, to come back to those pure moments of truth, those pure ideas, and then strip them of the overlaying culture that has shrouded them in the past, strip them of the dogma that exists beyond them. And so when we use our tools, if we are able to avoid what Aldous Huxley called man's infinite capacity for distraction, and use the huge access to information that we have to find those spiritual texts, and if we also sign up to the idea that there are many ways, there are many doors to the house of God, there are many paths up to the top of the mountain, that there are many fingers pointing to the same moon, what we're then able to do is also borrow and learn from foreign texts that are outside of our own culture. The Vedas, for example, from Hinduism, some of the more Gnostic texts that would otherwise be buried and misunderstood. These texts that aren't encountered in the core religions in which we are versed. And by finding that they all point towards the same sort of thing, we can therefore understand the complete picture from different angles and understand it more wholly. By really using the access to information that we have, that we've been blessed with, we can allow that to act like a catalyst to strengthen and deepen our own spiritual journey.
There is a psychology professor, Jordan Peterson, who related the stories of the Egyptian mythology, and they believed that there was a god called Osiris. He was the king of the gods, and being king, he grew lazy to look and lazy to act. And he was preyed upon by his brother, Seth, where we get the name Satan from. And this malevolent force, Seth, cut him up and distributed the pieces around the kingdom of Egypt. Now, when this happened, Isis, who was the goddess of the underworld, chaos, came up. So when you lose order, disorder rises, came up and tried to create him again by putting the pieces back together. But obviously, to bring order out of chaos, you can't just have pure chaos. You need something else. And what she managed to do, Isis, it's quite funny actually, she took his phallus and went back down into the underworld and made herself pregnant and gave birth to Horus, who was portrayed as a falcon, because the falcons have got very, very good vision. And the point is that the youth, Horus, grew up in chaos, grew up in the underworld, not knowing the structure of the kingdom. But he didn't underestimate malice, malevolence, and he came up and fought with Seth, who plucked his eye out. And half blind, he went back down to the underworld, back into chaos. And he lent his other eye, the eye of Horus, to the ghost of Osiris, the king of the gods. And together they came up and ruled over Egypt again. And the actual ideas in this are more important than the characters. I don't believe that the ancient Egyptians really believed that these figures, these gods existed. Rather, they were encoding the way they found to manage the natural force towards disorder. So in any structure built up, any edifice, any community, eventually it will be preyed upon by laziness. Laziness to see and laziness to act, and will therefore be vulnerable to malice. And what they figured out over how many hundreds or thousands of years was that by allying youthful vision, by allying the ability to pay attention and to really look afresh with the old traditions, with the old structure, you create something that can persist. Now, on another level here, we can maybe see corporations. Kodak, for example, invented the digital camera. And you would think, having done so, and a photography company with a lot of resources, they would have been able to do very well as the digital age in photography came to fruition. But they went bankrupt. And they went bankrupt because although they had the technology, although they had the structures in place, they were lazy to see and lazy to act. Whereas companies, for example, like Facebook and like Google, have been more aware of this slow decline of large organizations and have actually took steps to avoid it. They have, for example, bought startups. And those small startups, those innovative young bloods, are the eyes of Horus for the old structure. And so it is now that when we look at the old religious texts that we've inherited, whether that be the main canonical texts from the world religions, some of the Apocrypha, or even some of the lesser known texts such as the Hermetic principles on the Emerald Tablet of Thoth, what we can actually find with these is that old structure. We don't need to begin again as children, as Plato talked about. In fact, by finding these old ideas and breathing new life into them, through new attention, by providing that eye of Horus, we can stand at the gate and create order out of chaos. We can use these as a path, as guidance. We can stand on the shoulders of giants. But like an arrowhead, it can cut if you dig it up and wield it in the wrong way. These things retain their potency. They are powerful ideas, powerful beliefs, in the same way that you can get some diseases that have been dormant for decades, centuries, by digging up infected clothes, for example, infected areas. So too, these ideas that may have been dormant for a long while can be dangerous if used improperly. And in the East, there is a trend of this knowledge being passed down very carefully to the students from masters over a long period of time, for example in Tibet. And so we now have access to these texts thanks to the internet, thanks to the information age, but we also need to exercise caution in our use of them and seek out the gurus who will be able to help us along the way. And it may be that this has to be a one-way process of using the books, finding out the ideas and taking the guidance from there. But it also behoves us to find those people who may be on the same journey but further ahead. A lot of the yoga masters, a lot of the people in the religions are still on this path, but not shouting about it. But with the internet, we can seek them out and learn from them. So if you look at the dollar bill in America, you have the pyramid and the eye on the top. And it is that eye, that paying attention, that ability to really look, to really see, that gives life to old structure. Without it, without the structure, we are as children. It would take us far too long, lifetimes, to understand even a fraction of what's been encoded by our ancestors. And the structure itself is nothing without us. But together, it can be something quite interesting. Look at that lovely cloud. Look at that cloud. Look at those clouds. Look at that light. Beautiful. It's beautiful.